One question to ask is, how sustainable is the food you eat? So sustainability has three aspects: economic, environmental, and social. So the economic is straightforward. How much does the food cost? How much are you willing to spend? And so that's the issue with processed food. It's usually the cheapest option, especially fast food. For the environmental costs, these are usually hidden, and some of these are outlined here. So we've already talked about land, that's in the food print. And we have already also talked about water back in Chapter 8. Water is used for these large-scale factory farms. And in the United States, the Midwestern U.S., that all tap into the Oglala Aquifer, the underground reservoir that has been depleted through the decades for growing corn, grain, and for the livestock that eat it. Also part of industrial farming, large-scale farming, is a lot of chemicals are used. Some are fertilizers and some are insecticides and herbicides. So fertilizers are used to promote growth of plants. And so that's to get plants to grow faster. If you want more corn, if you want to increase the corn yield, the wheat yield, whatever you're growing on your farm, you use fertilizer. Whether a large-scale industrial farm or a small local farm or an organic farm, these farms all use fertilizers and pesticides. A fertilizer can be natural or synthetic. It's a chemical that is applied to soils or plants to promote growth by providing nutrients. A pesticide also can be natural or synthetic, and it's also applied to soils or plants to promote growth. But instead of providing nutrients, what a pesticide does is it kills off any pests, bugs, insects, or weeds. What a fertilizer does is it basically replaces a natural process in which bacteria that live in the roots of plants provide a fixed version of nitrogen. So this is what plants need, is nitrogen, but in these forms: NH4, this is ammonium, and NO3-, this is nitrate. Plants need nitrate and ammonium. Plants can't naturally get that. There's a relationship they have with nitrogen-fixing bacteria that either lives directly in the roots or in the soil. Bacteria take nitrogen from the atmosphere, that's N2, and through a series of reactions create ammonium and nitrate. Symbiosis between two different species here is that the plants get something from the bacteria. The bacteria also get something from the plants. What fertilizers do is they bypass the need of plants for bacteria to do this job. So this is a quicker way, basically, that taking a chemical fertilizer, so the chemical name of this fertilizer is ammonium nitrate, basically just applying the nitrate directly to the soil around the plants, and therefore the plants don't need to wait for the bacteria to fix or go through these chemical reactions to produce this ammonium or this nitrate. What this means is that the fertilizers that are applied to crops and plants in farming add a lot of nitrogen into the soil as this ammonium nitrate, so ammonium ion and nitrate ion. And this has an impact on the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle is a set of chemical pathways where nitrogen atoms move through the biosphere. This is similar to the carbon cycle. Has carbon atoms in the atmosphere as CO2, and then carbon atoms stored in hydrocarbons like coal and methane. Humans have disrupted the carbon cycle through burning fossil fuels. The nitrogen cycle has nitrogens in the atmosphere. Nitrogen, or N2 gas, is the majority of gas in the atmosphere. It's 78%. So the plants need nitrogen but can't use it in this form, N2. So the bacteria do this process called nitrification. They fix the N2 and turn it into ammonium and nitrate that then is absorbed in the roots of the plants. Humans have disrupted the nitrogen cycle by adding a ton of nitrogen in the form of this ammonium or the nitrate. This process is relatively new, using fertilizers, and that's because fertilizers have not always existed. These are chemicals that have only existed since about the 1950s. So here is showing a graph on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, this graph shows amount of fertilizers that have been used through the years. So going back to 1850 and up to present day, 2010 on this graph. As world population has grown, the need for food has grown. Since the need for food has grown, fertilizers became really important. Now, fertilizers have not always existed. Fertilizers as chemicals really were invented around the 1950s. The amount of fertilizer use increased exponentially after 1950 and has fueled the world population growth. All that additional fertilizer applied to plants and soils means that just as the carbon cycle has been disrupted by the burning of fossil fuels adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, the nitrogen cycle has been disrupted by our agricultural systems adding a lot of nitrates and ammonium into this portion of the nitrogen cycle. Just as there are environmental consequences for disrupting the carbon cycle, there are environmental consequences of disrupting the natural nitrogen cycle. At the same time, you also have to use insecticides and herbicides to kill off any insects and pests, or also weeds. So there's a lot of chemicals that are used in farms, and what happens to these chemicals, we know that water dissolves lots of things. So whether fertilizer, insecticide, or herbicide, these naturally end up in water and get washed into the local water systems and eventually make their way into the greater water system, which in the Midwestern U.S. is the Mississippi River. That Mississippi River all feeds into the Gulf of Mexico. So shown here is where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico is this darker water, and that's ocean water. The Mississippi River has a lot of nutrients in it, mostly from overall all this fertilizer runoff from all the farm. Fertilizer causes things to grow, and on a farm it's going to cause your crops to grow. When it meets the ocean, when it meets the Gulf of Mexico, this nutrient-rich brownish water from the Mississippi River causes algae in the ocean to grow, and that leads to algae blooms. And so this is a dead zone because when the algae blooms, these other naturally occurring marine species cannot grow. We have a local instance of this in spring of 2020 off the coast of California. Bioluminescent microorganisms were present in the waters, and what that led to was at night when it was dark, you could see the bioluminescence as the waves crashed ashore. Now that was cool to see. However, what it meant was that these bioluminescent microorganisms were present at the cost of other naturally present marine species that then could not grow. And as those bioluminescent organisms died off, you could smell it all the way into 5 miles in from Santa Monica. The other issue is waste that also gets washed into the waterways, the local waterways, and makes it into the Mississippi River. These livestock eat, they excrete, and that ends up in the water system. We've already looked at land. Land is needed for the livestock as well, more importantly, for growing all of the food that needs to be fed to the livestock, and that's land that's been cleared. Or there's also the effect of the erosion of the topsoil, that once that land has been used for farming, it's no longer pristine, nutrient-rich land. We know that food production requires water. We know that food production requires land. And we also know that food production leads to greenhouse gas emissions. This shows the carbon dioxide emissions to produce 1 kilogram of carrots, 1 kilogram of tomatoes, rice, cheese, or beef, steak. And so this is in comparison to land use. Beef, steak, that's the highest amount of carbon emissions as well. The carbon emissions come from the production, so the processing, transportation, packaging. More importantly, what happens with cows is that cows release methane. And so that's different from carbon dioxide. All animals produce carbon dioxide, just like you exhale, produce carbon dioxide. Chicken, cows, sheep, they all also release carbon dioxide, but cows in particular also release another greenhouse gas, which is methane. So methane is due to the fact that cows naturally eat grass. And this is when cows are fed corn instead of grass, they're not meant to be eating the corn, and they get indigestion. If you've ever had indigestion, what that does is it leads to gas, and that's what cows do when they have indigestion from eating corn instead of grass, is they fart, and that is methane emission. So methane is CH4, and methane CH4 is 20 times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. And so the carbon emissions are certainly something from any living animal, whether humans, cows, or chickens. But the cows that are fed corn have the additional methane emissions. This also is part of the footprint of having a hamburger. There's the water use. One hamburger is about 2 months of showers. One hamburger. Well, then there's also the carbon dioxide and methane emissions. That's going back to how sustainable is the food you eat. Another thing to think about is how far does your food travel to get to your home? Unless you live on a farm and grow all your own food, there's a carbon footprint called the food you buy, which is the food miles. This is the idea of eating locally produced carrots that are in season, or locally produced tomatoes that are in season, has the lowest carbon dioxide footprint on this graph because it hasn't come from very far. So what does that mean about bananas from Central America, or rice that usually comes from Far East? If you are interested in limiting carbon emissions or in lowering your carbon footprint, the food you eat, what a choice you make 3 times a day at least, can definitely impact and lower the carbon dioxide as well as the methane emissions. There are more reasons than just lowering your carbon footprint to eat local. You can benefit the local economy. It also generally is fresher and therefore tastes better, because when it's coming from a nearby farm, it hasn't had to spend 2 months on a boat or been refrigerated as it's driven on a truck from several states away. It's come fresh off of a tree or fresh off of a vine when you're eating local. It also keeps you in touch with the seasons. It is somewhat unnatural to have a strawberry in December, though we can have that in California, because locally in California means we have basically a lot of sunshine and a lot of things can grow. Asparagus is an example of a niche type of produce which comes from far away, higher carbon footprint than most vegetables and most produce. Something to think about anytime you can eat locally sourced produce that will lower your carbon footprint. What about organic foods? So food that is grown organically officially has been grown without antibiotics, growth hormones, conventional pesticides, or conventional fertilizers. So with the industrial large-scale farms, in order to grow lots of crops, a lot of fertilizers have to be used to promote the crop growth, as well as pesticides and insecticides to also cut down on insects and weeds. Organic foods essentially are grown without synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides, but they can still use natural fertilizers and natural pesticides. Now, organic foods minimize negative impacts on the environment as far as fertilizers and pesticides, so that's considered green and sustainable. Local is from nearby farms and has lower food miles and a lower carbon footprint. So that's considered environmental from the carbon footprint perspective, and also considered green and sustainable. Between local and organic, both of those usually cost more than conventional large-scale farming. The cost is part of the economic portion of sustainability. So that's the question when asking yourself, how sustainable is the food you eat? You have to factor that in as well. There's environmental, economic, and social.